For today's interview, we're going to be speaking with Mr. Joe Elkerton in order to take a deeper dive into the long-lasting detrimental impact of residential schools and the current situation faced by Indigenous communities. So to start, I'm going to let Mr. Elkerton introduce himself and speak a bit about his Indigenous heritage, his work, and his experiences.
Well, I'm glad to be here. My name is Joe Elkerton. I'm live in Toronto right now and spent most of my life here. My father is Chippewa of the Thames First Nations. That's down around London area. My mother's Ojibwe from Christian Island. So I actually take my nationality from my father. So I'm Chippewa of the Thames. I'm the youngest of 11 children. Some have passed away, but there's, I think, like 5 of us that are left. Both of my parents passed away many years ago. I ended up being adopted by a white family. So my mother was English and my father was Welsh. So that's kind of, I grew up in the city kind of under that circumstances. My parents were both products of the residential school system, and so that I think kind of fed into their challenges in life. That they ended up mostly with lots of addictions, alcohol, combination of alcohol, drugs, and then compounded that with the post-traumatic stress. That's what we call it now. It wasn't that way. They didn't name it that way in the past. It was just part of the deal. So I think that led into a lot of their dysfunction that was kind of undiagnosed at the time. And so I think that was kind of the pretty norm, I think, at the time for Indigenous folk. My brothers and sisters and I, we grew up in foster homes, and I think, more recently, I think we are the first generation in a lot of generations to raise our kids. So, my son and my daughter were with my wife and I, and that was kind of the beginning of a change and a shift, I think, in the culture. Anyhow.
Obviously, residential schools have impacted your life quite personally. But I'm also aware that you work with Indigenous communities or have seen their experiences. Can you share a bit about what you've seen residential schools do and the long-lasting impacts that you've witnessed?
Yeah, so been involved with working with Indigenous folk through a number of agencies. In Toronto, working with not-for-profits, dealing with a lot of folk who are street involved and have that lineage of First Nations ancestry or Indigenous ancestry. Work with World Vision, doing research on educational stuff in the north with the James Bay Cree, and also with different kind of faith groups around kind of how faith groups connect with Indigenous folks. So I think over the years, I think if there's one kind of constant through the broad kind of spectrum of Indigenous folks, it has been the fallout of residential school. I think that's the one thing that is kind of a commonality with most communities. In fact, I would say there's like probably not one community, whether on reserve or off reserve, that hasn't been impacted at some level by residential school. And I think that's a hard legacy for Canada, which on some levels on the international kind of scene is seen as this great peacekeeping, tolerant society, and yet there's this kind of hidden kind of history that they kind of don't talk about until somebody brings it up. But it's a sad kind of legacy of the broader Canadian society. But I think it's something that has to be addressed. I mean, if we're going to move forward, if there's going to be healing, um, and that's one of those things where I think it's generational stuff. I think even Justice St. Clair, as he presented the Truth and Reconciliation stuff a few years ago, he kind of commented in one interview that some of the recommendations were not for this generation, but for generations to think about. So I think that that healing and that restoration process is going to take a long, long time.
What do you think should be done by the legal sector, by the health sector to take steps towards reconciliation?
I think it's interesting because this is a fairly recent evolution in the history of kind of Canada and Indigenous folks. When you think about the long history in Canada, like, up until 1947, Indigenous folks were not allowed to get university degrees in Canada. So there was an absence of kind of that kind of university education level that went into Indigenous communities. And part of that was you know, that kind of stereotyping. Were they smart enough to kind of go to university? If they, and historically, when they first started going to post-secondary education, they went to be artists or they went to be social workers. And it wasn't until, kind of later on that actually folks started going to law school. And we started seeing, at one point there was only a few Indigenous lawyers in Canada, and they were kind of scooped up by corporations or government agencies. But I think what's happened now is that you're seeing more and more young people heading to law school, and I think what's happening. I know in several communities where the young folk have gone off to a university, gotten law degrees, called to the bar, and then have gone back to their own communities to start maybe addressing some of the treaty inadequacies, and also like looking for those kind of instances where there have been violations of treaties, where I think that hasn't happened in the past, and I think that that's one of those things that I think will kind of keep going as more and more young people become lawyers, and we start to kind of see that the government held accountable for some of the treaties. These are legitimate agreements. I mean, if Canada reneged on like international treaties, like with foreign countries, there would be taken to court, and there, or even with corporations, if they reneged with those, but they felt for years that they could just kind of renege on their obligations to Indigenous people, even though that they are legitimate treaties. So I think that as things evolve, the legal system is going to play a huge impact on it. And I think on both sides too, because I think when you think about treaties, that it's not just one-sided. It's not one side saying, "Hey, this is wrong." There's the other side that has to be accountable too. So I think it'll. I think for Canada, I think we're going to see an evolution of kind of how we address things. And you know what, we live in a pretty litigious society now, where I think those type of things are we can block roads and railway tracks and all those kind of things that we've done in the past. But I think that where the battleground is going to be probably in the courts, where I think that there's that kind of evolution and sophistication happening with Indigenous communities now, and just it's kind of one of those things where we've learned from the dominant culture that that's how you get things done is you can yell and wave placards as much as you want, but once it takes it to court and people start having to pay money, then it becomes real. So I think that's kind of, I think, one perspective of the possible future, I guess.
In your experience working with Indigenous people, what do you find to be their needs in order to heal, as you mentioned?
I think that, part of the part of the process is, and it can be frustrating at times, is hearing the stories. I mean, it's tough for people to tell their stories because of the emotions. The sad part is that, like, some of those stories that are really relevant to the community healing are, a lot of the old people are just getting old and passing away, and with that we end up losing part of our history or part of that story, and it becomes, you know probably like, just a written story that somebody reads at some point and say, oh, okay, so that was it. It's different when you have an elder tell about their experience. So I think that the healing, I think, in Indigenous culture, there's this kind of philosophy that every time you tell the story, a painful story, every time you recount that, somehow it loses its power on you. So the more we talk about our stories, then it loses its grip on you. I think that's a real kind of significant kind of process, and I think that also having kind of the broader society of Canadian society kind of hear those stories, because there's lots of folks who, for whatever reason, really are skeptical of Indigenous kind of, the stories or the challenges. They're like, oh, because there's a lot of misconceptions about, like, who we are. Like, we get all kinds of free stuff. We don't have to pay for this and we don't have to pay for that, which is really not true. I mean, we I live off reserve, and I pay taxes, and I still have to pay for things. I don't, I have a status card which entitles me to, maybe buy prescriptions or get paid for my university. But when you those are kind of like, in the grand scheme of things, not a lot. Like, when you figure about the treaty violations that have gone on. So I think getting the story out there and having kind of broader Canadians understand, I think that's the thing. And I think, this week we heard the announcements from the federal government that they're changing the citizenship oath to include, a mention of Indigenous treaties, and that as part of the new Canadian oath, which is, I think, really important, because as young people who, their parents may be coming from different situations or looking for a better life in Canada, knowing part of our history is really important. And I think that there was always kind of a fear that somehow our stories would get lost as as Canadian culture shifted from kind of a European centered, to a very multi kind of cultured kind of society, which is great. But I think that there was a little bit of concern that somehow, in the mix of all that, our stories would get lost. And I think that once once folk kind of hear about, like, that this has been a real struggle, and that we are the first peoples of Canada, and this is kind of where we're at. I think that those are important things that need to happen. So I think Indigenous folk need to continue to talk about their stories and to make them relevant. And I think Canadians uh, need to be open to hearing more and more about that, and understanding, I think, a bit about that, because I think that there's still lots of challenges, I think, out there.
I wanted to talk a little bit about these recent discoveries of these mass graves. Why is it important for us to have conversations about these events? What does it mean for us as Canadians? What does it reflect? And what does it mean for the Indigenous population, do you think?
I think it's, I think it's important. I think it was one of the in the '94 kind of areas of the um, recommendations for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the identification and the repatriation of children lost at residential schools. I think because it was so traumatic, you know, that here were your young children, some of them just really small, young in age, who were taken from their family unit, sometimes by force. It wasn't like we surrendered our kids, you know, in as some of the elders say, like they came and took them. Like this was the law in Canada. They took them, and you know, you didn't see them for years. So when you think about that kind of pain as a parent, like you know, I couldn't imagine that happening today. If I had been, you know, I think there would have been a lot of kind of conflict if somebody had come to my house and tried to take my kids and told me we'll give them back when they're 15. It was like, no, that's not going to happen, you know, kind of stuff. But it did happen, and so there's that kind of element of pain and dysfunction that goes into that, and then to have your baby never come home. That's gotta, as a parent, I couldn't imagine what that happened or what that experience was like. But it was the reality for a lot of Indigenous folk that their children went off to school and never ever came back. And more than them not coming back was there was no acknowledgement of where they were or kind of how it happened. There was just, you know, a lot of times, so the numbers are kind of skewed in that they do kind of come out with numbers of people who had passed away. But what isn't the real number is that there was listed in some of the lists of children who were listed as runaways from the school. We don't know what happened to them. So, you know, the number is probably larger than what they're saying. So there's a death record, and there's a record of kids who ran away from school and never heard from again. So we don't know what that actual number is. I think on a spiritual level, having a loved one pass away and being able to do ceremonies of closure and have them kind of with you is kind of important in healing. I mean, all cultures really have a ceremony around death, whether you know, the traditional one for Canada is like, you know, because of the European dominance, is like somebody passes away, you take them to the funeral home, and then there's a church service or something like that, or a service at the funeral home where you know a member of the faith community says some words, and then there's a committal at the gravesite as they lower the casket into the ground, and that there's these ceremonies that help bring closure to the folk who have passed away and to the folk who are kind of still here. So I think it's important that for kind of healing and closure that there are some type of ceremonies that help people deal with the loss of family members. Even though some of those parents are probably passed away by now, but the community still feels the pain because there's still kind of records of like X number of children from X number of communities that went to residential school and didn't come home. And so I think that, you know, within just having them kind of come and experience a burial in their land is really important. There's such a connection to the land with Indigenous folk, just like a lot of folk around the world, that there is a strong connection to, the soil or that geographical region that you came from. People always talk about that, not just Indigenous folk, but as human beings, there's a connection to kind of where we were born, where our parents were born. Sometimes it's, related to, various things, ethnicity and all those type of things. But I think for I think a lot of Indigenous folks having those loved ones return to the land, the ancestral land, so that they can be with their grandmothers and they can be with their mothers and all those type of things. I think are really important. I think that those are important things. I think for the healing, and I think that there's a definite sense that the spirits and the essence of those children are not at rest because of the kind of what happened or how their deaths are, and that like when you think about the dignity of a mass grave, an unmarked mass grave, it's not a lot of dignity in that, really. I mean, it's kind of mechanical, and yes, this is how you efficiently, intern bodies, but there's still a lot of sacredness around that, and I think that that's really what missing. And I think that that's kind of one of the important things about having the children repatriated, if not to their family members directly, then at least to their communities that they came from, so that community can begin to heal. I think that that's really important.
Is there anything that we as students, especially as like law students, can do to drive change?
Well, I think it's, finding those places where you can be allies. I think like making sure that you're aware of the issues. I think that those are really important things. I think that, it's a tough question because I think, you need to reach out, and I think with some respect, I think just make yourself available. I think that, you know, those are things that I think that are important without kind of driving an agenda, is like, kind of being the ally and say, how do we help you in this process, or like what can we do? I think that, there's, yeah, that's a pretty complex thing. I think the awareness is huge, and being an ally where possible. I think that those are super important.
Thank you so much for your time, Joe. You're incredibly well spoken, and I think that your perspective is so unique and important for people to hear. I'm so glad that I got to speak with you today. I'm incredibly appreciative. I've learned a lot from this conversation. I just wanted to reiterate what I've picked up is that residential schools, as well as all the other injustices that are faced by the Indigenous population, that were faced and even are faced today, something as basic as access to clean drinking water, it should hit you in your soul and your body. They affect parenting, which the effects last for generations, and the process of rebuilding that is going to take a long time. They obviously can't do it by themselves, and I feel like the most important thing is awareness, acceptance, atonement, and action, and that hopefully having conversations like these are one step towards the future, and I hope that we can become the change we wish to see. Is there anything that you want to add?
Just keep doing what you're doing. I think you guys are planning to be lawyers or something like that at some point, right?
Yes.
So I think I'm in the midst of like writing a Gladu right now. So that's just a huge thing, and there's such a lack of people who are knowledgeable in that. So, and even the courts sometimes are a little ignorant to that it is the constitutional right of Indigenous offenders to have a GLADU report if their loss of liberty is at in jeopardy, even in a bail setting or something like that. So but that's a whole other topic. So yeah, just keep doing what you're doing. I'm glad you're having these conversations.